Hi, so I am recording this video to show you how to walk through the procedures of using SPSS for a factorial ANOVA. So I have this data set, which I showed you in class. It has a few variables. It gives the participants, and we have about 204 participants. It gives their gender. Um, it gives the type of training that they received. And to explain this, this is a potential research study. This is fake data, but I've been thinking about giving people different types of suicide gatekeeper trainings, and incorporating in the gatekeeper training a little dimension of spirituality, of Christian spirituality or Christian theology. And I thought, well, I wonder what that would do in regards to making people feel more effective in asking about suicide, and whether it had any impact on stigma towards suicide. And so that's the two variables we have. It's the intention to ask. So if someone is depressed, how likely are you to ask them about suicide is the question. And it'd be on a rating from 1 to 7. So 7 meaning they'll definitely ask them about suicide, 1 being they'll definitely not ask about suicide. And then stigma, if intention, higher is better. Stigma, as you might imagine, higher is worse. So the numbers, it's a rating scale. So kind of imagine a questionnaire on stigma towards suicide. 7 being very stigmatizing, blaming, rejecting, not wanting to associate with any person who has thought of suicide or who has attempted suicide. And then 1 just the opposite, someone who is more affirming, who is empathetic, who is understanding of the internal struggle in regards to suicide. And so the question is gender related to each of these dependent variables, the intention to ask and the stigma toward suicide? Is training type related to the intention to ask and the stigma toward suicide? If they have control, if the control training, the spiritual compassion training, or a theological history, talking about the history of theology related to suicide. What are the differences when the training incorporates the control condition or the spiritual compassion or the theological history condition? What impact does it have on intention to ask, and what impact does it have towards stigma? And again, this is fake data. But the Factorial ANOVA says, I don't want to just ask about gender. I don't want to just ask about training type. I want to ask both of these questions, and also whether there's an interaction between them, whether your gender has an effect on how impactful the type of training is on your intention to ask, and how impactful it is on your stigma towards suicide. So how do we do this? Well, to run a Factorial ANOVA, you're going to go to Analyze, and we're going to go in a new area. So we've looked at descriptive statistics before. We've looked at compare means, but we're actually going to go here. You will likely have this task, button here, General Linear Model. I have this next one down, Generalized Linear Model. You probably don't have that, but the General Linear Model, and you're going to go to Univariate. A univariate refers to how many, it doesn't refer to how many independent variables, it refers to how many dependent variables there are. In our case, we have 1 dependent variable that we're going to look at. So we're going to look at each of these dependent variables separately. So it's univariate, 1 dependent variable. So I'm going to click that. And it brings up this box, which has a lot of additional boxes. But we're really interested in only these top 2, the dependent variable and then the fixed factors. The fixed factors are the independent variables. So the dependent variable is going to be, we're going to focus on this one right here, the intention to ask. How likely are you to ask a person who's depressed if they're thinking about suicide? So that's going to be our dependent variable. And then we're asking a question: is gender related? Is the gender of the person related to their intention to ask about suicide? So that's one of the factors. And then the other one is training type. Is the type of training that they receive related to their intention to ask about suicide? Okay, so we have two fixed factors, two independent variables. Both of these are nominal. Gender and training type are nominal. And then we have one dependent variable. This one is a scale. And so the next, I kind of encourage you to go through all of these at once. Otherwise, you'll have to go back and forth. So we're going to go to plots. Plots are graphs. And I find it helpful if you do the graphs in a couple different ways. So the first one I want you to do is move gender to the horizontal axis, and then training type as the separate lines. And then you're going to click add. So that's going to add the plot. We're going to ask for a line chart. But I also think it's helpful to see it in a different way. So I'm going to put training type as the horizontal axis and gender as the separate lines. This is the same information. It's just going to look a little bit different. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. So I'm asking for two plots, two graphs, and I'm going to click continue. I'm also going to ask for post hoc. And so gender, if we get a main effect for gender, we know exactly why. It means that males are different from females. They're either higher or lower. So we don't need a post hoc for gender because there's only two groups. But if we get an overall result that finds that training type is significant, we need to know which of them are different from the others. So we're going to ask for a post hoc test. Is it because control is different from spiritual compassion? Is spiritual compassion different from theological history? Or is theological history different from control? So we're going to do a post hoc test to look at that. And since we've done this before, we're going to stick with Chaffee. And so we're going to click continue. And then we're going to click on options, and we're going to ask for a few things for it to display. We're going to first off click on descriptive statistics. This will give us the mean and standard deviation for genders versus males versus females. It's also going to give us the mean and standard deviation for control and spiritual compassion and theological history. And it's going to break it down by male and female. We're also going to ask for the homogeneity test. This is the equality of variance test that we saw before, the Levine's test that looks at, are the different groups equally spread out? Then we're also going to ask for the estimates of effect size. So this is going to provide us with eta squared. Okay, so because we click on this, it's going to provide that automatically. And that's all we'll be asking for. So we're going to click continue. And that, I believe, concludes our analysis. So we can now click on OK. And when I do, pull this up. When I do, make it a little bit larger, we get this result. It's a univariate ANOVA, analysis of variance. And this is another way of another term for factorial ANOVA. So here it shows that we have, for gender, males and females, and we have 82 males and 122 females. So in this sample, females outnumber the males. And then we have a balanced grouping of the three training types. So we have control with 68 people, spiritual compassion with 68, and theological history with 68. Then we have our descriptive statistics. Because we click that box, it reports it for us. So I'm going to go down here actually to total for male and total for female. And I'm going to point out that the males as a whole had a mean of 5.38. Females as a whole had a mean of 5.85. What this means is that females reported that they had greater intention to ask about suicide than males. at least in the sample data, right? We don't know if this is significant, but we see that there's a a pretty decent gap between females at 5.85 and males at 5.38. We also see, let's see here, if you come down here to the bottom, you can see the differences between control, spiritual compassion, and theological history. So you can see here that the theological history actually was associated with the highest level of intention to ask about suicide. So for this one, we see that on average, those who got the training that included theological history, they were a 5.88 in regards to likelihood to ask about suicide. Those who received spiritual compassion training were 5.69, and the lowest was those in the control condition, 5.43. Again, we don't know if that's significant, but it is, yeah, there's a pattern at least emerging. And then again, for the standard deviation is also provided here in this second column. Next, we have the Levine's test, and so this is our fourth assumption of the Factorial ANOVA. So the first is random sampling, and we met that. Second is the right type of measurement scale. So we have two nominal independent variables and one scale dependent variable. So our variables fit with the analysis that we're using. And this is not significant. It's close at 0.07, but because it's not significant, we could say that the assumption of equality of variance is met. So we did not violate the assumption of equality of variance. Now down here, this table is really the meat and potatoes of our analysis. This is where we discover if we have a significant effect. And really the first place you want to look is this line here, the first line, the corrected model. This is the big picture. This is saying, is there anything with all the independent variables? We have 2, but you can use this with 10 or 20 independent variables. This is saying, of all the independent variables, can we be sure that the effects we see with them are not just the result of chance? And so we come here and we can, again, you can ignore some of these boxes here, but right here is the most important. The significance is 0.000. This is the eta squared. So this is gives us the some information about the effect size. But remember, for the first question is it significant? And the answer is yes. So if you do not have significance here, you stop. You're done. There's nothing else you do. You don't look at the independent variables by themselves. They might be significant. Sometimes they are, and the overall is not significant. But you don't go any further if this is not significant. But it is. It's less than 0.01, so we can continue on. And where do we go? Well, this next line, intercept, it's not very important. We covered it in class, so I'm going to go ahead and skip it. I'm going to come down here to gender. Gender, if you go across, you find that the relationship between gender and the intention to ask is significant. It's less than 0.01. So we see here that we have a relationship that doesn't seem to be the result of chance. For training type, we have a significance value of 0.01, and that's, of course, less than 0.05. So again, we have a significant effect here. We can say that training type is related to the intention to ask. We don't know which training works best, but we know that the different means of the people that experienced the different trainings were different, that they were not all the same. Now, the third line here is for the interaction between gender and training type. And you can see here that this is not significant. So what this means is that the effect of training type did not depend on one's gender. So the training type, it was significant, and that means the effect of the training type wasn't greater for males than it was for females. As far as we can tell, it was about the same effect on males and as on females. Okay, so we have here our F overall. So this is actually where you would start. You have the overall F and then a significance value, and then we have over here the partial eta squared. Now, I want to come down a little bit further because the next question is what kind of, we know that there's an effect with training type. Is it that the controls are significantly different from spiritual compassion, or spiritual compassion significantly different from theological history, or maybe are they all different from one another? Well, we use the Shafei, and the Shafei is conservative, but it did find a significant difference between control and theological history. So this one right here, you can see the asterisk, significance 0.002. This is significantly different. If I come back up, so theological history and control, if I come back up to descriptive statistics, I can see that the theological history was a 5.87 and the control was a 5.43. So that is a difference of, what is that, 0.44. So you have a relatively large difference between these two groups. So if they were in the training that had the theological history embedded in it, they were much more likely to at least report that they're going to ask about suicide than if they were in the control condition. And there's not a significant difference between the control and spiritual compassion. So we cannot be certain that the differences, we see some differences between them, but we cannot be sure that that is actually significant. Now, it's very helpful to look at the graphs, the profile plots, because these show you, these will help you interpret your data. So first off here, on the x-axis, we see the gender, male and female. So over here is a score for males as it's broken down between control, spiritual compassion, and theological history. And over on the y-axis is their mean value for the intention to ask about suicide. So you could see for well, let's start with this red one here, spiritual compassion. If they were in this training, they're about a 5.39, males are about a 5.39 intention to ask about suicide. Here, for the theological history, they're about a 5.5. And down here on blue, it's hard to gauge, but it's about a 5.3. Now for females, you can see that the line is sloped positively. So for each of these groups, the females were higher on the intention to ask than the males were. So you could see here that for those who were in the control group, the females were about 5.5, but all the way up here, if they were in the spiritual compassion or theological history, they're over 6. Now this graph down here, it really is the same information. It looks very different, but it's exactly the same points. So here, the training type is the x-axis and the marginal means. Well, this is still the same. This is the means for the groups, and then the lines represent the different genders. Up here, they represent the different training types. So we only have 2 lines here because there's 2 genders. So the males, you could see again. The control group was lowest, followed by spiritual compassion, and then theological history. And then we could see in each case, the females were higher than the males. This just draws more attention to the differences between, it just presents the information a little bit differently. So when I look at this, I could see that these lines are certainly parallel. there doesn't seem to be much difference in the relationship between spiritual compassion and theological history. Obviously, males are higher than or lower than females, but the effect again looks about the same. But notice how this slope is a little bit different from the slope of these. If the slope is significantly different, that's an indication of an interaction. So if the slopes are different between them, if they're not all the same, then that's an indicator of an interaction. So this suggests that there could be an interaction. Now, when I come back up here, I realize that there's not an interaction. The p-value is 0.266. So what I'm seeing here is not actually significant, but it at least draws my attention to say, oh, most of the time, these other two conditions, there's a big gap between males and females, but for the control condition, there's less of a gap between males and females. That's generally a good thing, except that this group is the worst performing one. So it would seem to me that if I'm trying to suggest a type of training, I would say it doesn't really matter between spiritual compassion and theological history. They're about the same for females, and they're about the same for males, and they're generally preferable. But I would point out that the effect that the control condition, or I would point out, sorry, that there's a big gap between males and females in this type of training. It's still better for males, but it seems to appeal more to females. There's a bigger boost for females. Again, that is suggests an interaction, which again is not actually significant. So you have to be careful not to do too much interpretation. Okay, and you can do the same analysis of this graph as well, but I think we talked through it enough. So hopefully that's helpful, and yeah, and hopefully that shows you the steps for Factorial ANOVA. Let me add one more thing. If you, well, actually, no, you don't need it. So I think we're good. Sorry about that. So hopefully that's helpful, and hope you enjoy this. All right, I'll stop there.